Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. I'm Sam Clift, and in this watercolour tip video I'm going to be showing you how I painted this juicy raspberry in watercolour and finishing a little bit with colour pencils at the end just for the tiny details. This is a really great project for anybody to do at home. It only took a couple of hours and I think it would look great in any kitchen. It's really fun to paint these things larger than life so that you can get in the tiny details and really use your observation skills to pick out the little tonal changes in colour. Gives you an opportunity to practice mixing your paints, and it's a lot of fun as well. So I really hope you enjoyed the video. I'm beginning with a really light wash of the lightest colour that I can see in the reference photo, and the reason I'm doing this and so not going in with too heavy hand is that it's a lot easier to lift this up if I make a mistake. I'm mapping out where the highlights are, so I'm not going into those as I want to preserve those and leave those as the white of the paper. I'm now going in with a slightly darker colour so that I can really see where the highlights are. On the left hand side of the raspberry it was a little bit more kind of purpley in tone, and on the right hand side it was slightly more orangey. Obviously it was kind of all pink, but it had these little kind of undertones, and so I wanted just to map that out as well so I knew where I was going forward. I'm now going in with a very much thicker paint consistency, so I've mixed up quite a lot of the darker pink and a little bit of blues just to make a slightly purpley colour to map out the shadows, the darkest parts of the raspberry, which tend to be in and around the little kind of beady sections that make up the entire fruit, the little seeds I suppose. So I'm going in with a thicker paint and mapping those in so that I know where I'm going. And you can see it's starting to give the raspberry a little bit of shape. It's looking very disjointed at this stage. The contrast is massive, but we're going to fill in the midtones later on, and that's when it will start coming together. So having faith that it will work out. It looks very odd at this stage, but it's all about mapping it out and working out where you're going. So on the right side, the darker parts were actually not as dark as on the left. There was more shadow on the left hand side. So I'm using a slightly lighter colour, going in with a little bit more orange, a little bit more pink, the lighter pinks in this way. And I'm going in to the darker parts that I can see. And then I'm adding a little bit of water and filling in some of the midtones. As you can see, I'm going in and just again leaving out the highlights, which is really important, but I'm going in and just filling in the midtones of each seed of the raspberry. I think that's what they're called, using a kind of scribbling, stippling motion with the tiny paintbrush that I'm using. I'm using a naught here to get a jaggedy edge so then I can really fill in. It's not a crisp line with a highlight, actually it's quite a jaggedy edge, and this is what gives it the realism because it's not too uniform. So I'm going in with a kind of stippling motion to make sure that it looks as realistic as I can. Going in with a slightly darker colour on the left hand side. I've mapped out the right now, which is slightly more pinky orange, and now going in adding a little bit more of a darker crimson colour and possibly a touch of blue or grey just to make sure that I've darkened the colour just slightly to make sure that it gives the raspberry form and shape, because it's really important that you get the shadows where they need to be. Getting them as dark as they need to be, and this we can adjust a little bit later on, but for now I'm just mapping out where the darkest parts are. And now I'm adding a little bit more water to that mix, and I'm going in to the sections that aren't highlighted but are lighter than the sections that I've already done, and just filling those in. I'm also going into the sections between the little seeds, because they're not completely white, they are actually like a pinky colour, sometimes a little bit grey in sections. So I'm just filling those in, and that's going to bring the raspberry together. Going in with a slightly darker colour on the left hand side, you can see it's a little bit more purpley. but it is bringing the raspberry together. I'm filling in those mid-tones. And you can see those little individual little seed pods, the juicy sections, are starting to gain some kind of shape now. It's not looking so flat anymore. It's actually creating that kind of form to every little part of the raspberry. It looks rounded and it's starting to look quite shiny, and these little sections are really quite important. There you can see I've done this over the working my way across the raspberry, and it's really starting to look a little bit more like it's meant to now. Using that watery mix and adding plenty of water, and I can actually go into the darker parts and slightly scrub on the brush to make sure that they blend in nicely and it's not too disjointed. So I'm going to go into the darker parts now and just add a little bit more pigment. I find with watercolours, well, most people will find with watercolours, is that when they dry a little bit lighter than how they look when they're wet. So it might be that, you know, it takes a little bit of adjusting, and that just takes practice. Going in with a colour that's slightly darker than you actually want. And I was finding that I had to adjust as I went on, because as I got other sections in, then I noticed that some of the parts that I'd already done weren't as dark as they needed to be. So constantly looking at the reference photo and constantly going in, adjusting, letting it dry in between layers to make sure that it doesn't all bleed in and make a kind of watery mess. I'm going wet onto dry so that I've got the most control that I can over the paint. It doesn't just spread out. It's not the look I'm going for. Now going into the highlighted sections and just making sure that they're not completely white. Some of them are brighter than others, and that's important because that's what gives it the form, because it's where the light is catching, and that needs to be kind of coming from one direction. If you've got it coming from all different directions, that's when it starts to look a little bit strange. Going in with the mid-tones again, just darkening those up a little bit more. Just adding a little bit more pigment to the watery paint consistency. And because these colours are quite transparent, you can see the work that you've done underneath. So you're not painting over what you've already done. You're just building up the layers around it so that they become much more joined together and create that lovely form and shape that we want. You can still see the darker parts underneath. Darkening up the left-hand side and going in with a little bit more grey, a little bit darker into the darker sections. And you can see now I've added the mid-tones, actually the darker parts, especially on that left-hand side, aren't dark enough. So I'm going in with a lot more pigment, a bit thicker paint, and darkening up the darkest parts a little bit more. It's only when you've got the other sections in that you notice that you need to go a little bit darker in other parts. And that's always easy to do. Going darker is fine. It's making sure that you haven't put paint where you don't want it, because lightening up with watercolour is quite difficult. It will lift, but it does tend to leave a bit of a stain. And if you want the paper to be a highlight, so the paper showing through, then it's going to be a little bit stained, and that's a shame, because it's not going to be as bright as you need it to be. So again, darkening up those shadows, you can see that that's creating a 3D form now. You can see where the light isn't catching that left-hand section, and so that's making the rest of the raspberry stand forward and creating that curved shape. Now I've got the darker parts in, I know I need to add in some more into the mid-tones, and so darkening up those a little bit more, adding a little bit of detail as I go, a little bit into the top of the raspberry, which is really quite dark. And then I can go in to the other shadows and just darken those up a little bit more. Using that paint, just watering it down a little bit, just so that I can use it across the raspberry and darkening up some of the little sections that need the shadow darkening up, you can see that's really creating more of a 3D look. And again, going in with the midtones and darkening those up some more so that they look a little bit more joined up. And they give it a much more juicy, shiny look. And going over the whole of the raspberry, doing the same thing. So it's always a case of stepping back, seeing which sections need a little bit of work, and then going over those sections again. But this is the fun part, just adjusting, readjusting, and watching it come to life. Darkening up again. There you go, really adding the darker paint a little bit more bravely now. And as I said, going in a little bit darker than you think you need because it will dry a lot lighter. Adding this to the other parts of the raspberry that need that shadow. And then going into the midtones and just making sure that they join together nicely. It's not too disjointed. And adding some of this colour to the right hand side to bring it all together. I'm now going in with a white Caran d'Ache pencil just to add some of the tiny little highlights that I couldn't get with the brush, and going over some of the shadows because there was this kind of broken up highlighted effect, and that really adds to the realism of the raspberry. Just these little final touches. And just darkening up and crispening up some of the edges. Once I've added the little hairs, it starts to really come to life. And once the stalk in again, you can see what areas need adjusting. Just adding some tiny little details to the hairs just to finish everything off. And the raspberry is complete. I really hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, it'd be great if you can like and subscribe, and I'll look forward to seeing you in the next video.